Stronghold? Stronghold? I mean, what that sound like? It's powerful. There is no place else in this city that has a name that sounds like that.
It's 1958, and Malcolm Taylor comes home to D.C. after 2 years in the Air Force. He moves in with his parents and gets a job at the Library of Congress. By 1960, he's organizing the Pee Wee football team with the boys who run around in his neighborhood's alleys. Back then, the neighborhood was called Metropolis View, though you won't find that name on a map today.
3 of my boys, Johnny Bryant and 2 others, went to the movies, and the movies at that time was the Sylvan Theater down on Rhode Island Avenue. And in the movies, the picture was a cowboy and Indian picture. And the Indians kept saying, "We're going back to the Stronghold." So when the 3 of them came out of the movies, it was time for football practice. And they came down to the field, and they kept talking about the Stronghold. And the other guys didn't know what they were talking about. They were telling them about the movies. So after football practice, it was time to run back. We always ran from the football field all the way back to the houses. And everybody started chanting, "We're going to the Stronghold, we're going to the Stronghold." And all the community could hear the chant. So my little football team therefore named the community that they live in the Stronghold.
Stronghold is tiny. It's just 7 square blocks along the eastern edge of North Capitol, the street that divides the city in half. It's a border town on the margins of one of the city's most conspicuous divides.
Everybody asks me, "Where do you live?" They want to know northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, that kind of thing. I live in northeast. I go, "Oh, okay." You know, like, if I said northwest, I mean, just right across the street. But I'm like, oh, then me, oh, okay, that's different. I mean, that's nice. Oh, they're thinking I'm living in the hood, you know. That's what they're thinking. I assume nobody says it, you know, at least in my office.
Back when it was called Metropolis View, Stronghold was white, working class, and it was mostly German. Here's Kirby Vining. He bought a house on Franklin Street in the late 1980s, and he's also the neighborhood's unofficial historian. We talked to him and his neighbors in the living room of his house this February.
I've doing some research on the history of houses that are in Stronghold, and I'm finding some really weird stuff that I never knew about. There's some really strange legal, they were segregation policies, but for example, one of the things I found out, all your neighbors on Bryant Street all got together in 1947 and signed a covenant to the deeds for their houses. It is, "I will never sell, I will never rent to a Negro."
Is that right?
I am not kidding.
So, if blacks couldn't live in Metropolis View, they must have come from somewhere else. Turns out some came from Foggy Bottom, now one of DC's most exclusive neighborhoods.
Hi, how you doing?
Hi.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Gloria Burns. I live on Girard Street, Northeast. My grandfather and grandmother used to live on 8th Street, Northwest in Foggy Bottom, which is now Georgetown took over. A lot of the blacks in DC used to live in Foggy Bottom, because everybody knew everybody, you know. Most of the black businesses was around in that area. I remember on the corner was a drugstore, and I remember they used to have a little bar where you go and get your ice cream and stuff like that, and you sit at the counter. Stewart's funeral home used to be down the street. And on the other side was an apartment building where most, families, I think maybe about 10 families lived in it. And then across the street used to be DGS store. And DGS owned a lot of the little grocery stores in DC. And then on the other side was another apartment building, which I think is now George Washington Dormitory.
Foggy Bottom was once an industrial hub. But in the 1920s and 1930s, many of those factories closed. The jobs were gone, and people who could afford cars left. It was mostly poor blacks who stayed. In the 1950s, George Washington University expanded through and brought along rich, white residents. By the end of the decade, home prices were 50 times greater than at the beginning of that same decade. As a former resident put it, if you are born in a place, it becomes a part of you. We bought this for a home. Years ago, they thought this was the worst neighborhood. Now they think it's the best, so they chase us out. So, Gloria's grandparents and cousins, they moved up north to Stronghold. It was still primarily a white neighborhood.
Then after a while, like I said, a lot of the whites move out, and then when the blacks move in, we more like a little family because everybody knew everybody, you know, when these people start moving in.
And this takes us back to Malcolm and his Pee Wee football team.
In the evening, my mother and father both had great jobs. I would be waiting for them to come home from work and waiting for my mother to cook dinner. I wasn't gonna miss dinner. She was a great cook. So I would go across the street in the back alley with the boys, with the older and younger than myself, and just play football with them for a couple of hours and wait for my mother to put the dinner on the table and I leave. But the young fellas played such great ball, two-hand touch, in a narrow space. I asked them, what in the world could y'all do if we were on a field that was 50 feet wide and 100 feet long? We could be the champion, coach, we'd be the champion. But they were a great unit and they were fierce and they were organized and they just played together as a team. So they ran over the other teams, just ran over. Saturday morning, all the community would be down in front of my mother's house. You've seen some of the pictures. They'd be down there. I depended on the community for transportation. No buses. I depended on the community. And the community had great pride. We were the only ones the first year who was in full uniform, pretty uniforms as you see in the pictures. Nobody had, and most of all, they didn't have cheerleaders. So the other little teams would stay around. If they played before we played, they would hang around to watch our plays, watch how we played, and see our little pretty girls.
The people we spoke to remember the 60s as a happy and peaceful time in the neighborhood. People were close. But by the 1980s, violence swept into Stronghold. Crack was on the market. Here's Kirby again.
One night we came home from Bangkok and we were standing here on a hot summer night and heard a bang, 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 and we got so good to recognize it. That was a Tech 9. Remember, that was one of the favorite guns of those guys? And there was some sort of dispute that was going on in the alley beside Grady's house. But it was kids that none of us knew. They had made some deal right there. And then two guys ran around the corner and just collapsed and bled to death right on the front step of number 15.
Even amidst the drugs wars, even then, people bought homes and raised families. Anne bought her house in the neighborhood in 1987.
I'm Ann Brooks, a resident of 12 Bryant Street, Northeast, Washington, D.C. My son was about, I'm saying 8, but I think he was about 10 years old. He was about 10 years old. He went to school in this area. He went to K.C. Lewis at the time, right across from Howard. You know, with the drug activity and everything else, I just did not want that for him or myself because it bothered me. We were new in the area. And I think how I got involved with Stronghold, it was basically around drugs and the activity that was outside of my home. And it was the older people that said, hey, let's just sit outside, let us all come together on someone's stoop, I forget his name, Mr. Al. His stoop, and we would just sit out there and take names and they knew these young people who was doing, because they've been around here 30, 40 years, and we would take the license plates of people, and we were like bold. If you are bold enough to do your activity in front of our elders, then we're bold enough to sit out here, talk about you, and then start writing down names.
And then, as has been common in Stronghold, Anne began organizing the children.
I used to take about 5 kids, and I don't know if I should give their names, but they had a lot of drug activity in their family. But what I used to do is take them with me and my son, whether it's to church, we went to McDonald's, we just went to the library. I just engaged them because I didn't see a lot of positive role models in their family, and a few of their relatives were dying of drugs, and they were so handsome, they were so smart, and yet I knew I didn't see a lot of positive role models. So I just wanted to be that little light in their life. And now I see them, they're all grown up, handsome young men. But now they don't have no time for me. But that's how they get.
Today, Stronghold is safe, it's clean. With an aging population and rising taxes, it's got a new problem to confront. One of identity. Once, the neighborhood was almost entirely black. Today, blacks make up 60% of the population. So here's Bridget. She's seen the city change drastically since she came to DC in 1975 to go to Howard University. She bought her home in Stronghold in 1988.
Do you think it's like a race thing, or do you think it's more like a class?
There's no possible way to separate those. In integrity, you cannot separate those, especially not in a city like DC. Race and class are completely intertwined. And that's not to say there aren't wealthier black folks who can be, gentrifiers themselves. I've been one of them, when I've bought in a neighborhood at a price that was way above, what other people had paid to be there. And so it does concern me that people who have been a part of this community and been the fabric of this community and have maintained this community all of a sudden end up, getting priced out, either because property taxes go up, or because they can't afford to maintain their homes, which is a real issue. It's really distressing to see people moving in and not thinking about that.
But some people do think about that. Some people do think that neighborhoods and cities are not just brick and cement, but they're home to people and cultures worth preserving. So, we'll leave you with Faith, who moved to Stronghold 7 years ago.
I purposely decided I wanted to buy in the Washington, D.C. area because it was changing rapidly. It was gentrifying. It was beginning to exclude some people, and as a person of color, I thought it was important to remain in a city that had a rich history of people of color leading it, defining it, shaping a culture. So if it was smart growth, DC would figure out how do we continue to honor and create a space for some of the residents that have historically lived here. It's a matter of how does the city honor that.